Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas, my crafty friend. Juliana Michaels, and thanks for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing how I created this Christmas card for the Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous Christmas 2023 Live. I'm going to be sharing 3 of my favorite techniques for card making, including stamp and smudge, ink smushing, and heat embossing, along with all the details on how this card came together. If you're interested in the supplies I've used, you can find links to them in the description box below. When you shop through those links, it supports me, and I really appreciate that so very much. However, I also encourage you to feel free to use your amazing stash of supplies and maybe even give some love to supplies that need it. As always, there will be a blog post available with written details and more photos, and you can find the link to that in the description box below as well. Now let's get on with the making. First up, I'm going to be working with the Winter Woodland stamp set. This one has such a great vintage vibe and could be used throughout the year for masculine cards. I'll also be using the Jolly Holiday stamp set, which has a fantastic retro vintage style that speaks to my heart, especially that Santa. To get started, I'm going to place a piece of distressed watercolor cardstock cut to 3 3/4 by 5 inches into my stamping platform with the smooth side up, using some repositionable adhesive. This just helps hold the paper in place so I don't have to keep moving the magnets around. I'm using distressed watercolor cardstock because it can stand up to the variety of inks I'll be using and it tolerates water well. The first technique I'm going to be using is one of my absolute favorites for creating backgrounds. It's the stamp and smudge technique. I recommend using Distress Oxide inks for this technique because they are slow drying, which gives you time to smudge the ink and create some really wonderful distressed effects. Here I'm selecting a variety of stamps from the Winter Woodlands and Jolly Holiday stamp set to use on my background. When I use this technique, I like to kind of plan out where I'm going to stamp the various images. So I'll often lay them out on the paper to get an idea of what image I want where, as well as what color I want. I also know that I'm going to use the Santa as a focal point on the card, so I'm going to work around that as well. For this technique, I usually stamp at least 2 to 3 images with the same color of ink and position them so the color is spread across the paper, forming a bit of a triangle with each other. Even though I normally only do 2 to 3 images with the same color of ink, this time I'm actually doing 5, and I'm going to stamp all of them with Rustic Wilderness Distress Oxide ink. As you can see, the images are spread across the paper. After I stamp the images, I like to take a paper towel and lightly dab off some of the ink. I then take that same paper towel and use it to rub over the images and smudge the ink. By dabbing off some of the ink before you smudge, you don't lose as much of the detail from the stamped images. This is especially helpful on images that have more solid areas on them because they will hold a lot more ink. And as I mentioned earlier, Distress Oxides are a slow drying ink, so even after you lightly dab off some of the ink, the remaining ink is still wet enough to smudge. Now I'm moving on to the next ink color, so I'm adding some various ephemera-like stamp images and once again positioning them so that they are spread across the paper. I'm also keeping in mind that I'll be placing the Santa image on that right-hand side. The ink color I'm using here is Uncharted Mariner. And then, just as before, once I stamp the images, I dab off some of the excess ink and then rub the paper towel over the ink to smudge the images. For the next ink color, I'm going to add this pine tree, the holly branch, and the Jolly Good Christmas text. The Distress Oxide ink color I'm using here is Cracked Pistachio. And once again, I'm going to repeat the same process as before and dab off the excess ink and then rub the paper towel over the images to smudge the remaining wet ink. Here I'm going back and adding another stamped image because I feel like it needs a little more Uncharted Mariner to help balance the design. For the last of this technique, I'm going to stamp this image using Iced Spruce Distress Oxide ink. With this being a larger image, I do move my magnets to the edge of the paper as an extra bit of security to help hold the paper in place. I'm also using a Stampendable stamping tool to help apply better pressure over this larger stamped surface so that I don't have to use my fingers to push. I then repeated the dabbing and then the smudging. And here's a look at the stamp and smudge background. Now I'm going to switch gears and work on some of the embellishments for my card. To create these, I stamped a bunch of the ephemera type images from the stamp sets onto a smooth side of a piece of distress watercolor paper that I've placed on my stamping platform. Here I'm just filling up the paper with the various images so that I can make good use of the paper. I'm also going to stamp the full-size Santa image. I'm going to use archival ink in Rustic Wilderness for the ephemera pieces. I'm using archival ink because it's permanent and it won't bleed or become activated during the next step. Here I'm applying the ink, stamping the image, and then repeating this process a few times to get a nice stamped image. I'm also using the Stampendable stamping tool once again since I'm stamping a larger area of paper. Once I get those stamped, I grab the Fired Brick archival ink pad to use on the Santa image. I repeat the stamping until I get a good image. My plan is to stamp the image multiple times and fussy cut it and create layers for more dimension. Here I'm placing it so I can stamp the top half of the image a couple of times to create those layers. Next up, I'm going to distress the paper a bit by ink smushing it into some old paper distress ink. To do that, I'm taking the old paper distress ink pad and smushing it onto my craft mat. I then spritz the ink with some water using my distress sprayer and then smush the paper with the stamped images into the ink. You can smush it into the ink as much as you like. I then used my heat tool to dry the ink. Once the ink was mostly dry, I repeated the ink smushing process to add more layers of interest. You can repeat this process as much as you like as well. After I finished with the ink smushing, I used a pair of detail scissors to fussy cut the ephemera and the Santa. As you can see, I have the full image of the Santa, the top half of the Santa down to the trim on his coat, and then just his head, including the hat and beard. For all of these fussy cut pieces, I also inked the edges with some walnut stain distress ink. I then used double-sided foam adhesive to adhere the Santa layers and create some dimension. Another fun touch on this would have been to add some of the Snowfall grit paste and/or rock candy glitter to the trim on his suit. Next up, I'm going to add some heat emboss details using this star stamp from the Jolly Holiday stamp set. Before you begin heat embossing, you just want to make sure that the ink is completely dry or the embossing powder will stick to it. As an extra bit of security, I also recommend rubbing over the paper with an anti-static powder. After I rub over the surface, I then apply embossing ink to the stamp and begin stamping it onto the background paper. I'm going to stamp this same image several times. And because I'll be moving the stamp around to different places on the paper, I find it much easier to use a stamping block instead of a stamping platform. After I stamp the image, I place the paper onto a piece of computer paper and then pour liquid platinum embossing powder over the area. I pick up the paper, tap off the excess powder, and then move that out of the way so that I can start the heat embossing. I let my heat tool warm up and then begin to apply the heat to the powder. If you happen to be new to heat embossing, you want to make sure that you hold the heat tool about 6 inches away from your paper. But this depends on your heat tool, so you may need to hold it closer. I recommend starting further away and then bringing it closer if you need to. The embossing powder will slowly begin to melt and then it'll turn shiny. Once one part of the design begins to melt, make sure you keep moving your heat tool to the next part to make sure the powder doesn't bubble or cause the paper to discolor or burn. Just keep the heat tool moving and of course be careful that you don't get too close to your fingers and burn them. You can also hold the paper with tweezers that are made for heat embossing. I then continued stamping and heat embossing the star images to add it to the lower right and upper left portions of the background. A little side note here, I did stamp another image here in Uncharted Mariner because when I laid out my embellishments, it was covering some of that up and it just needed to be balanced a little more with that color. Now back to the background. I'm going to add some walnut stain distress ink to the edges of the paper using a foam blending tool. You could also use oxide ink here as well, but I like the way the two ink types add depth and interest when you layer them. The oxide inks are pigment-based, so they will tend to cover up what you put them over, whereas the regular distress inks are more dye-based and will blend and fill in with what is there. After I finish inking the edges, I like to take my distress sprayer and slowly pull the trigger to add larger droplets of water. I then like to do a combination of drying the water droplets with my heat tool and dabbing up some of the water with a paper towel to create more depth and interest. This part of the process can be repeated if you so desire. I usually end up repeating the process of adding the water and drying it 2 to 3 times. And here's a look at the completed background. Next up, I'm going to layer the background onto a piece of metallic craft stock cut to 4 by 5¼ inches. I chose the lighter gold color that matches the liquid platinum embossing powder I used. I then take this distressing tool and rub it along the edges of the paper to distress them. The tool I'm using is part of the Sizzix Surfaces tool set that also includes a craft knife and a trimmer perfect for cutting wrapping paper. If you don't have this tool, you can also rub the backside of a craft knife along the edge to get the same distressed effect. And then to distress them even more, I'm going to use a Ranger sanding disc to sand the edges I just distressed. This is just a small piece of fine grit sandpaper, so you can use that or a sanding block, or you could just skip this part. When working with sandpaper, make sure to put something under your paper to protect your work surface or you'll scratch it with the sandpaper. To finish this off, I then ink the edges with walnut stain distress ink, just like I did the main background. This darkens the edges of the paper just a bit, and I like the contrast it adds. Now I'm going back to the embellishments. Along with the stamped ephemera I created, I also wanted to add some die cuts. I cut several of the greenery pieces from 3 shades of green cardstock. The die sets I used are the mini holiday greens and the festive gathering die sets. To add some interest to the die cuts, I'm going to apply Distress Grit Paste Snowfall and some rock candy glitter. Snowfall Grit Paste is a translucent paste with a dimensional gritty texture, and it contains clear glitter. So when it dries, it adds a textured, sparkly finish to your projects. I'm using a palette knife to apply the paste, but you could probably also just use your finger if you don't mind the mess. Here I'm applying the paste to the edges of the branches, thinking about how snow might land on them when it's falling. After I finished applying the paste, I sprayed rock candy glitter onto the wet paste using a glitter duster. I'm going to spray the glitter off camera over my trash can just to help contain the glitter and decrease the mess that glitter is well known for. You could certainly skip this step, but I wanted a little more sparkle and shine, so that's why I added the glitter to the paste. After I spray the die cuts with the glitter, I put them to the side to dry. It's not recommended to use a heat tool to speed up the drying process when working with paste, because it will cause the paste to bubble. I then repeat this process on the remaining greenery die cuts and set each one to the side to dry. To create the sentiment on the card, I used the Christmas cartoon stamp set. I stamped the image with Rustic Wilderness Distress Oxide ink onto a piece of cardstock that I had ink smushed with old paper distress ink, just like I did for the stamped ephemera pieces. And then I lined up the image a second time to get the words in a straight line and stamped it again. I then trimmed it into a strip and inked the edges with walnut stained distress ink. Here's a look at the fully assembled card. I cut a piece of distress white heavy stock to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches and inked the edges with walnut stained distress ink. I then adhered the background and metallic craft layers to this piece. Next, I adhered the die cuts and ephemera embellishments using Artiste glue. I adhered the Santa and the sentiment with double-sided foam adhesive to create even more dimension. And there you have it, a festive retro vintage Christmas card packed with texture and dimension. I hope you enjoyed the process and techniques I used to create this card. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend. Thanks so much for watching. I'm so grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.